Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Frankie. Welcome back to my Women's Health Wednesdays with FemFresh. In this video, I'm going to talk about the importance of the pelvic floor and a little bit about urinary incontinence, so stay tuned. I think it's really important that we don't ignore the pelvic floor, and this is because when I say pelvic floor, lots of you will assume that this is only something that you need to think about when you're a little old lady when we talk about urinary incontinence. But that's actually not true, and it can affect younger women too. So it's very important that you know about it and that you can do things to prevent your pelvic floor weakening as we get older and prevent you getting the common symptoms of a weak pelvic floor, which I'll talk about later in this video. Women of all ages can be affected by a weak pelvic floor, and the main symptom of a weak pelvic floor is urinary incontinence. Now, there are actually two types of urinary incontinence. The first being stress incontinence, and this one you might be familiar with. This is where the pelvic floor, which is the muscles that line between the pubic bone at the front and the coccyx at the back of your tailbone, and it's a sheet of muscles which supports all of the openings of the urethra, which is where you wee from, the vagina, and also the back passage. So if you have anything that puts pressure on the pelvic floor or the bladder, such as coughing, sneezing, laughing, bouncing on a trampoline, for example, and you have a weak pelvic floor, it can cause a little bit of wee to come out. And that's the most well-known form of incontinence. That's called stress incontinence. There is another form of incontinence called urge incontinence, and this is where it affects the tone of the bladder wall, and if you've got to go, you've got to go then, you've got a lot of urinary urgency. But that's a different type, and that's more to do with neurological conditions. There is also a third type called mixed incontinence, which is a combination of both stress and urge incontinence. But when we talk about the pelvic floor, we're talking about stress incontinence. So the pelvic floor helps support the bladder and the opening of the urethra and prevents wee leaking out. Now, there are lots of reasons that the pelvic floor can weaken. The main one is with age, particularly as we enter menopause and the estrogen levels drop. That can weaken the pelvic floor muscles, and that's why there's this common misconception that a weak pelvic floor and incontinence only affects little old ladies, but that is in fact not true. The pelvic floor can also weaken with pregnancy because that increases the pressure in the tummy, putting more pressure on the pelvic floor muscles. Also, if you have a vaginal childbirth, that can also stretch and tear the pelvic floor muscles, which can weaken with time, particularly with increasing number of births. Other things that can also weaken your pelvic floor include chronic constipation and a chronic cough, because those things can also increase the pressure on the muscles. We talked about the main symptom of a weak pelvic floor being urinary incontinence, but there are actually a couple of other symptoms. One may be a feeling of a dragging sensation down below, and that can actually be a sign of vaginal prolapse. A weak pelvic floor can also affect childbirth and also your sex life. So one thing we can do to keep our pelvic floors healthy and strong is pelvic floor exercises. And there are lots of exercises you can do to strengthen the pelvic floor over time. And you can do these when you're young too, to prevent it weakening with age. You don't just have to wait until it's already weak later in life. So doing pelvic floor exercises a few times a week can be really useful for strengthening your pelvic floor. If you are affected by any symptoms of a weak pelvic floor or urinary incontinence, it's important that you speak to your own doctor about this, because there are actually lots of things that they can do to help you. As I mentioned, we commonly associate a weak pelvic floor with older ladies, and that's actually because it tends to be the younger women that don't go to the doctor about it. So stats show it does affect younger women, but we're afraid to talk about it. People are embarrassed to talk about this, and therefore it's underreported and underdiagnosed, which makes the stats seem like it's not as frequent in younger women, and that isn't necessarily the case. I hope that we can bust this taboo, and if you are affected about it, please go to your doctor about it. It can massively affect your quality of life, and there are things we can do to help. If you have any questions about pelvic floor or urinary incontinence, feel free to leave a comment in the comment box below, or if it's something that you don't want to discuss publicly, feel free to direct message me, but please know I can't give personalised medical advice over Instagram. My name's Dr. Frankie, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye now!